Good afternoon and welcome to the Takeup. Today we have episode 97, Q&A 7, Blowing Up Designs, Digitizing Prep, and Cap Conundrums. Hello everybody and welcome to the Takeup. Happy to have you in on this wonderful Friday afternoon. Afternoon here, at least in the mountain time zone where I am in Albuquerque, New Mexico at the wonderful Brilliant Studios. And certainly happy to see people jumping on and doing our discussion, being here live. As you guys know, this is another Q&A session. So this is pulled from kind of the virtual mailbag, things that people are asking me lately, things that people are having trouble with. Might be some stuff we've covered before, but I think there's always new things to discuss and ways to discuss them. So I'm hoping that some of you guys will get in and hopefully be here asking live questions, derailing me if you want to, and we're going to have some discussion about what we're talking about what kinds of problems we're having in embroidery right now, what are we having in our apparel decoration businesses, and what does that mean to how we're producing. So let's get into it. Let's start in by talking to some of the great folks we have, some of the reciprocators who are here hanging out with us today. First, we have Curtis. Curtis says hello. Hi, Curtis. Happy to have you in. Cindy is in from Texas, driving but listening. Happy to have you in here as well, Cindy. Be careful. Don't look at that screen. Gary is in from North Texas. Looking forward to this great discussion. Looking forward to having you here as well, Gary. Frank from over in the UK, awesome community contributor. Good evening, Frank. Happy to have you in. Adelina is in as well. Hi to you again. Happy to have you in, and thank you for being in the earlier shows. Beck is in saying hi. Terry says, Happy New Year. Well, Happy New Year to you, Terry. Also, here we go. Jenny says, good evening from the UK, but I couldn't help but see this too. Justin Arment, a digitizer and also someone who educates over at the Embroidery Nerd, says, hello, FYI, I went out and got a bagel after the half today. If you missed my other live show this morning, The Half, we talked a lot about my original career, the first career I ever had, if you want to call it a career, the first job I ever had, officially on the books, was as a baker for a big bagel chain. So we talked about that a little bit, and apparently I inspired some bagel desires over there for Justin Armenta. Suffice to say, I've done a little bit of everything aside from becoming educated in something I'll never do and becoming an embroiderer on the side. It turned into something though. Hey folks, you never know where you're going to get into, but thank you, Justin. And hopefully you enjoyed your bagel. Fanny is in saying hi. So hi, Fanny. Happy to have you in. Barb is in saying hi as well. Hi, Barb. Happy to have you in. We have Devrin in from Washington. Ellen is jumping in and glad to finally make it on time. Hey, I am fine with any stray emojis you want to put up. Feel free. And Ramona saying good afternoon. And Brian Bailey, Creative and Brilliance, who provides for us this awesome Brilliant studio as well. Good afternoon to Brian. And also, hopefully you guys will notice really lovely new connection to the studio here. So we are on fiber. We are hooked up, and we hopefully won't be having some of those problems we've had before with connections. So really lovely, running great speed tests, doing great synchronous up and down. Very happy to see the connection is very strong, nice, primo. So thank you, Brian, for helping getting that put together. Suffice it to say, we are going to discuss a lot of other things that have nothing to do with bagels or the internet, but hopefully we will get into some things that will be helpful for people. In any case, like I said with these question and answer mailbags, if you have a question live that you want to talk about, by all means, come in, derail the questions. Let's talk about those things as well. But we do have some stuff that I wanted to cover. Like I said, in the channel cap, you can see that we have this episode devoted to a few different things. Number one, blowing up designs, and what you actually can't see me because I'm not on camera right now, but I'm giving you the air quotes because blowing up designs apparently means a couple different things, because I got into a discussion with people where they were discussing blowing up designs, and it meant more than just scaling them up, though we will talk about that. The next thing we have on here is digitizing prep. I want to talk about the ways in which we prep digitizing, in as much as I think the way we look at art affects how we actually execute the art. And that's something that I come from a particular background and want to discuss what I think my background changes about how I digitize. And then cap conundrums, I just want to talk a little bit about caps and cap hooping for some folks who are having trouble with that as well. So if you have anything that's along those lines, feel free to jump in. We do have a links list today. So I'm going to put that up on the screen for you folks, and I will get that into the comments so you have something clickable and easy to get to. But if you're catching this on screen later on the stream and you don't have those comments, hopefully the links list will be easy enough for you to get to. We have some interesting articles and stuff here that might be helpful for you. So we'll drop that into the comments for everybody. But let's go ahead and pop that up on screen, and we will take a look at some of the stuff that's there. Like I said, this is always material that I consider to be, if not alternate, is extra material. If you're the kind of person who gets more by reading, sometimes it's easier there. You want to watch a couple other videos or throw something on to listen to that might help with these things. The links list can sometimes give you some extra material that'll help. In any case, part of what we have here is actually earlier episodes from the Takeup. So if you haven't just seen the list of all the videos that's there, if you search here, up in this little search box that's on the top of the videos tab from my channel over here, what you're going to find is that you can search inside the videos and find a wealth of stuff that's on there, and it actually searches in the text of what's been said in the video to some degree. So it is a pretty good chance to look at some of the earlier stuff that we have here. And honestly, some of these are germane here, because I was talking about redrawing the way we look at our art and prep for embroidery prep for digitizing. So you can find some of that great stuff here. And one of the things that I wanted to bring up there was this. We actually did a previous Q&A, a couple Q&As back in episode 80. We talked about scaling stock designs a little bit. And about building backgrounds and designs. And that one's the one that people really liked and enjoyed. So hopefully that'd be something, if you want to check that out again, that will go a little bit more into scaling stock designs, though I'm going to talk about different kinds of scaling and blowing up designs as we get into this. There's also a couple of great articles, or at least I think they're pretty good. They're my articles. So every time I say they're great articles, I feel like a little weird telling you guys that. But we have a good one from Mr. X-Stitch blog, I'll Prep and Punch, about drawing and embroidery digitizing. And in here, we talk about the way we digitize in the real world and prepping and working from different artwork sources. So once again, if you get better educational value from reading, this is a way to get some of the things I'm going to say in a reading instead. The other thing we also have here, we have a video that I did with Madeira years ago, but honestly, some of the basic stuff that folks are dealing with, it comes up over and over. It's perennial. And in this case, this is a basic outline. It's a webinar we did about caps where we discuss the different things that are going on with caps. The cool thing I did in the links list that's different is I went ahead and included the slide deck. So you can actually go through the slide deck yourself later on. And this is something that Madeira had provided previously. It's a little harder to find. Sometimes the links are there, sometimes they're not, but I have the direct link for the slide deck. So you can check out some things that we discussed in the video and look at those slides in a much more refined version. And we can talk about those. But yeah, I'm going to discuss a little bit about those. And especially the big one for me is dealing with stabilizing, and particularly stabilizing caps that don't have a lot of internal stability for themselves, and how I handle that. So all that stuff is available on the links list. Like I said, it's not something you have to read, but if you want to go and read, you want to catch a couple other videos on specific topics outside of the Q&A, by all means get to that, because we're going to have a bit of a shorter episode today, hopefully, where we just answer some questions. And hopefully, like I said, if you have some things you want to ask either on these topics or on any other topics related to digitizing or embroidery, or honestly, e-commerce and the apparel decoration business, by all means, reach out and let me know what's going on there. But with that, let's go ahead and start at the beginning, frankly. Let's talk a little bit about blowing up designs. In this case, the first thing I thought about this, and here's where we have to talk about communication with people. Sometimes when I get into discussing problems with people, you'll find that you've missed something they've said, or that they have a different terminology than you do, and you end up kind of on the other side of this misunderstanding. And I'm going to tell you right now, this is part of what happened with me. I discussed this with two different people who were talking about problems of blowing up designs. It turns out they were talking about two different things. One of them was talking about what I thought was the common concept of what you mean when you say blowing something up, and that was scaling it up, upscaling a design. And honestly, they were taking an existing stock design and they wanted to scale it up. And in this discussion, we had a couple of different designs being used. And part of the problem we had with this is that not only were they were talking about scaling it up, and someone else was in this discussion, they were talking about taking the design apart. And so they meant blowing up as an exploded, or let's imagine like a diagram of a piece of technology. We have an exploded view of something where all the parts are visible. Everyone who's got an embroidery machine and has to look in the parts guide in the back of it understands what we're talking about with that exploded view of something. They meant blowing up a design like that. So I'll talk a little bit about both, but they actually have some commonalities here. So whereas if you go back to that video about upscaling stock, it's going to get into the basic concepts of what makes a design scale well or not. And certainly the first thing I'm going to say before we get any further with this, everyone likes to give you a stock percentage. Somebody will say it's 15%, it's 25%. It is whatever percentage that you can go to scale up a design or to scale down a design, whatever it is. But the truth of the matter is, I don't believe that there is one solid number there. That really is A rule of thumb to keep you from causing problems with particular stitch types, particular configurations. More of this is covered in that earlier video about scaling up stock, but I think it's worthwhile to go ahead and stop and just talk about the embroidery considerations really quickly, even though, like I said, there's some commonalities between taking a design apart and scaling it that we're going to talk about in just a second that has to do with file types. But for right now, let's just talk about blowing up designs and what it's going to be like as far as scaling. What are the things that make scaling possible or impossible for a design, make it turn out well or not turn out well? Certainly, there are embroidery considerations. And if we're talking about the embroidery considerations for that, this is about the limitations of the stitch itself. It's about the limitations to some degree of the way it's going to stitch and how it's set up. And the problem is these can also be dealt with differently depending on the file type you have and the way that your software processes the design. But the basic embroidery considerations are about parts of the design that will or won't scale well. What this usually means is, what is your longest stitch? If we don't have any ability for our software to process the design or change the stitches, there are softwares out there, and Brilliant's among them, that does processing on the individual stitches so that you can say that there's this top stitch length, and once we get past a certain stitch length, we break that stitch into more than one stitch. You can do that kind of processing, but let's say you're not doing that. Let's say we're just trying to scale that piece and we don't want to change the texture of the stitches or add or remove stitches. Then we have to say, when we're scaling up, the things that are going to cause problems are the longest stitch. We don't want to have that ka-chunk that we've talked about before, that double cycle where we have these extremely long stitches that slow down our machine and might be loopy or easy to catch or snag. So the longest stitch in the design is going to make a difference. And certainly with that, we're going to say, will the design still run well on our machine? Is it past our maximums? Or if we do have processing engaged, am I okay with the change to the texture of that area? So let's say we have a satin stitch that has a really long section in it. If we scale this design up and we have this really long stitch in it, how is that going to hold up? And do I care if it splits that stitch, if I end up with a split line down the middle, or if I use some sort of randomness to split it? Or am I going to have to go back in and do some sort of editing? Now, this is talking about working from a stitch file. So we're blowing something up. We're trying to scale it up. Look for the longest stitch. If our longest stitch is already somewhere past 10 millimeters, we've got a centimeter long stitch, an incredibly wide stitch, going very far, 25% is already going to take us very close to or past maximum stitch lengths on a lot of machines before we get into those slow ka-chunking stitches that are really just long jumps. And depending on how your machine's set up or how your software is set up or what you're doing with filters. And by the way, go back and watch my episode about pre-flight, about looking at your files before you send them to your machine. And we'll talk about that, stitch filtering in your software. Depending on how that stuff's set up, you may even incur problems with trims where you will stop, tie, and trim on every one of those things, and they will not be read as a normal satin stitch. So when you're expanding something, how do we tell how much we can blow it up? Well, part of that is going to be the longest stitch. The other stuff is going to be based on your design itself and what kind of details it has in it. So, I mean, that's really part of the problem. If we don't really know what we're doing as far as that, if we don't take into account the fact that details change that can be altered, we might have some issues with that rescaling. So I'm actually going to take a portion of a design and kind of show you what I'm talking about. And then something just kind of go ahead and do live and show you what I'm discussing. It's just, you can't just think about the longest stitch. You can't just think about that stitch filtering. You also have to think about the way stitches look, especially when we're dealing with things like straight stitch detail. So whenever someone gives you that percentage, they may not really be thinking about that. This is a portion of another design that I'm going to be discussing, but part of the design you can see here, and this is taken from a stitch file. This is not something that is done in objects. So we're not scaling the objects. It's not going to refactor density aside from just processing density. It will process that. But processors and objects, no matter what they do, they don't change pieces of a design that have straight stitch detail like this. So aside from the technical embroidery considerations, now we're into creative considerations. If I look at this design and it has shading, and the full design looks like this, right? This is what the full design looks like, and it has some shading that when we're zoomed in, it looks, it's just small engraving-like shading designs. They're fairly random, so in this case, it might be all right, but what we have to realize is the further apart they are, that is what we would consider lower density. If it were a fill, it would be getting more show-through, it would be lighter, and as shading goes, when lines are further apart, the shading is lighter. You're changing the tone of the design. And if any of the stuff has hard nodes, even in your working file, we'll talk about that again in a second, when you scale this stuff up, the spacing between these lines is going to get larger. So even if I'm working with something simple and single color like this, once I start blowing it up, even though you can see the stitch processor has done wonderfully, as far as all these satin stitches, the density has stayed exactly where it was when we started. Satin stitches are great, but do you see how clumsy and how spaced out that shading looks? It doesn't look like shading anymore. All these little details are very angular, very jagged because they weren't made for one thing, they were made with hard nodes to a degree. So even if I have the objects, you're going to see that scaling is going to change the way those look. But when we're talking about stitches, we only have the stitch penetration points. We only have the coordinates of the stitch to work from. And because we can't analyze that and say, I need more detail work done in here, this detail doesn't exist. You can't process that in. So when we're talking about scaling up designs, the things we have to look at are both embroidery considerations. Certainly, we might have the longest stitch in this be too long, and I might want to process the longest stitch that's in this satin and add breaks to it or something else to keep from having that incredibly long stitch. That's a technical consideration. Here we have creative considerations. If I liked the way the shading looked, then I may not like that same shading once I blow it up and we have this both an angular look if we haven't put in, like I said, if we're not working from the working file that might have curved lines that where it could reprocess where those lines have curves. If we have the original stitches, we're not going to reprocess into another line. We're going to have a jagged angular look because we know that all stitches are straight lines. If we don't have the original lines to work from, if we're working from a stitch file, those details can't even maintain a curve, even if they're drawn with curved nodes. And no matter what we do, straight line details like this, shading will get further spread apart and will get lighter. You can't really avoid that when you're rescaling something that has that engraving style detail, especially if it is a full engraving style piece. The likelihood is you're going to have issues with that. So when we're talking about blowing up a design, the first definition of blowing up a design, there are those different considerations. It isn't just a matter of 15% and it'll be okay. The reason we can say that is most of the time, even when we're dealing with really long stitches, the chances are that you're already at a 12 millimeter stitch or a 12.5 millimeter stitch, and that 15% is going to throw you over is low. Most designs we're working with are not going to have those extreme stitches that are extremely long or extremely short if we're shrinking down. Now, if we are trying to shrink down, if we're not trying to blow up a design, we're trying to scale it down, then we're starting to look for your shortest stitch, your smallest stitch. You don't want to end up with a stitch that's shorter than the movement of the needle from one side to the other than the width of the needle. You don't want to make a ton of those stitches. Do we have some stitches that travel that small? Absolutely. If you look at most standard fills, you're going to find, even with 40 weight thread, that there's a 0.4 millimeter chisel edge stitch, the travel stitch between the two lines, but you're not going to find a chain of them together. Whereas if I have a bunch of small stitches in a straight stitch line that doesn't process, that isn't part of that density processing, and we're working on a stitch file, when I shrink it down, we're going to end up with stitches that are too small to run unless I'm applying some filtering. And even then, if I'm applying filtering, you're going to find that we might not hang close to lines. So blowing up and shrinking designs, it really is about longest stitch, shortest gap, because we also know that as things get closer together, they start to cover more of the fabric behind them. They get darker. So those engraving lines, as we shrink down, get darker, closer together. They create fills. As we blow them up, they get wider apart, they get looser, they get lighter. So in blowing up designs, in shrinking designs, we always have to look for those details. If we have engraving style details, if we have individually drawn lines and shading that aren't part of a regular fill that can either be identified by software and processed as a fill, or if we have like the original object file, that we can actually process that object, we can actually regenerate those stitches. If we don't have that, and or if we have something that's not regular, that's drawn with a straight stitch tool, that's drawn with lines, the chances are scaling really cannot be that drastic. However, if we have something like a filled outlined letter, let's say I have a filled letter or an applique letter that just has a satin stitch border on it, all I'm really looking for on blowing that thing up is if I'm going to have the longest stitch be too long, be longer than my maximum that I want, or if I'm going to have some sort of drop in it or some sort of break. So when we're blowing up designs in that way, that's part of the issue. The thing is, there is a commonality between whether we want to talk about taking stuff apart. Once again, I had this piece and I was showing you that in a file that's not an object file. And we'll go ahead and put that back up on stream. This is just a portion of that file. And if we're looking at this piece, this one is actually also As you see, it's not objects, these are color breaks. When we're breaking up something like this, you'll find that you can't do a thing like people consider to be ungrouping. You can't ungroup stitches. Stitches are already in a color break. That's really all that they're there to do. You only have the color stops, you have those codes, you have the jumps, you have the stitches individually as they are. That's all we really have in the stitch file. We don't have objects in most stitch file formats, so we can't do things like separate out one letter or copy and paste one letter unless we want to select the stitches themselves. So we do have some commonalities when we're talking about that. So let's say, for instance, that you are wanting to run this design, but you want the C off of this design by itself. If you don't have the object file, we're obviously down to selecting stitches. If we're blowing it up to get that done, then that's part of the issue. The thing I also encounter with folks who are really new to the embroidery world is they don't always realize that, unlike print, unlike some vinyl, depending on whether or not it's processed out to be a single layer, there are elements that are not going to be there, even if we have all of this stuff split up. If I go into this piece, there is no red behind here. I have cut out the areas. I have taken elements away from the base layer that aren't going to be there if I start to blow up the design. So the issues that we have with this are more about an understanding of the files. And in that case, I want to talk about the files and the way that the files are built just briefly to discuss with anyone who has had issues saying, all right, I need to move, let's say, this design. I want to move all of the text up by a little bit. The problem being that even if I can select the text itself and move it up by a little bit, this design has been made for embroidery from the get-go, and it doesn't have those elements there. I could, if I'm working on the object file, I could go into the object file and edit, but you're going to find that the way I digitized it, at least, I'm not going to have any elements behind all of this where it starts to get too dense. Sometimes one layer is satin on a layer of fill. I'm not going to cut that out, depending on the way things are layered. And in this case, this is actually built of multiple pieces of different sorts of textures of fill and satin that I used to create this heart design back here. I definitely was getting conscious about the fact that I'm building up quite a lot in these layers. But at least in this case, you could certainly say, once I move something, I can go back in and I can edit this piece, and I can go into my creation and, edit the individual lines, and I'll regenerate shapes. The thing is, that means you have to match software with whoever's working, and you have to have the working file. So that's the other thing I want to talk about as far as blowing up designs, whether we're talking about scaling or we're talking about taking pieces apart or using elements or reusing elements from the design. File type is going to make a big difference. And I've even seen people, strangely enough, run afoul of this when they're early digitizers with their own work, where they will save something out to a stitch file and then try and use elements from it and not have saved versions. If you are working on something and you are absolutely not sure of the next thing you're about to do with that file and you think you may have to move something later, save an extra version of the file that maintains the original piece. Like, let's say I was working on this piece and I don't like the way the S is turning out, but I've finished it already. I'm not sure if I'm going to need it or not. Let's say that a company is working on their name or logo style and they're going to change something and they're not sure about how it's going to turn out. They've decided to change it after you've already started digitizing. Save the original version off so that you still have the objects. Don't save over your original piece. You will often need to go back and make alterations. And if you need to make alterations, the last thing you want to do is do it twice. No one wants to do the drawing twice. Storage is cheap. Get an external drive, get out to Google Drive, whatever you have to do. Don't throw away the early versions of the piece. If you look at the top of this particular piece, because I was discussing the way it was going to be executed with people when it was going on, which you can't see unless you get really close to this piece, is that this is version 6. That is version 6. Why is that version 6? I was debating on how I was going to render some of the pieces that were in the background of this logo. And because I was debating on the way I was going to render it, I decided to save multiple versions of this design so that even if I made a decision to change something drastic about how I was drawing the shapes, I could go back to my original piece and I could work on it. In that case, the file type was drastically important. I need the working file because the working file, we're talking about embroidery, the working file contains this. It contains all of these nodes. It contains the vector-like shapes that we actually use to draw the original piece. That's the working file. The working file is going to allow us to make alterations to the shapes that are involved. We need that to be able to do that level of editing. If you're working on somebody else's design, if you're working on something that is a stitch file, even if we use software that processes to shapes, and I'm not a real big fan of processing to shapes, the chances are we're not going to get the fully original shapes. And most of the time, what we actually have are just stitches. And that's the thing. There are different ways you can take, different approaches that software takes to doing things like scaling on a finished design. One of them is to reprocess the shapes out of it to try and make from this design this original working file, to try and get back to that by guessing at what shapes were there and guessing at the nodes that were involved to draw it. That's one way you can handle that in software. The other way you can handle it in software is to do what this is doing, which is to process the actual stitches and guess at what stitch type it is and then fill in individually. It is a stitch conscious way of doing it. Instead of processing to objects, it's going to factor the stitches out and it's going to maintain density. So I just did that on the stitch file. And as you can see, it maintained the densities from the stitch file being resized. But those are the two kind of ways you can handle it. What I'm going to say, quite honestly, is no matter which way you go, the more detailed your work is, the more you've used special functions and features, the more you've gotten past straight flat angle fills, the more likely it is that some of that processing, either on the stitch side or on the object side, is going to be a little strange. And definitely on the object side, you will not get a one-to-one representation of the original working file when you process it out. You will not. I know that sounds terrible to say, but I have used software that does that. Output the entire DST, the entire whatever stitch-based file from that, and brought it directly back in. No time, no processing, no nothing. I didn't do anything to the stitch file, didn't scale it, bring it directly back in and let it process to objects. And very frequently, individual fill blocks will be broken into multiple fills. Traveling runs that were automated, that were made by the system to travel inside of a fill stitch, will turn into run stitches or objects. And they don't all come in exactly as I drew them in the first place. And that's with the digitizer putting it back through the same software program. So to assume you're going to get a working file back out of a DST file, of a stitch file, is pretty unlikely. You're not likely to get exactly what the digitizer made from a stitch file almost ever. And so what I'm going to say is maybe minorly controversial. If you need massive alterations to a file and you've had it digitized, the chances are you're better off contacting the digitizer to have it done. And if you need massive changes in scale, even if it's not going to cause those artistic problems that we talked about, those creative problems that you're coming about, you're better off scaling massive scale changes especially on complicated designs, if the original file is being used. Can you scale that? Absolutely you can. Stitch processing, as I showed you when I was scaling the piece just a second ago, stitch processing can provide wonderful density compensation and put you back to where you need to be with densities, especially when we're talking about standard stitch types. That absolutely can happen. You will be fine scaling that stuff frequently. You just saw that those satin stitches maintained perfectly, scaled up quite a lot. I mean, I went probably 200% and the densities were still the same as the original density because it was calculated from the density that was already there. However, if you need massive alterations done and it's not your file, the best thing you can probably do is have somebody do those alterations. And frankly, when we're in the range of 200% scaling, the chances are that the choices the digitizer made in creating that file need to be changed. I don't make the same choices about how much detail I put into a left chest as I do on a jacket back. It just isn't the same. So for most folks, the truth of the matter is when you're scaling designs, you're blowing them up, working from the working file is your gold standard. Having someone do it is the best if they've done a detailed piece. However, if you're doing the other kind of blowing up, you just need to take a part off of something. That's when we're talking about something that might be possible, or it's at least a little easier to handle in the stitch file. If we're just removing pieces, we're not scaling and we're not making massive changes, we want to reuse an element. That's something where you might be able to do this either on your own or in normal editing software where you're not actually going fully into digitizing. And I think that's something fair that we can also discuss. So like, let's just say we have a simple design. I'm going to bring a simple design up just to kind of discuss it real quickly. Simple old design that I did in some old software that I'm not currently using, so I don't have that here readily. This is a stitch file. So can I blow this up a little bit? Yeah, I'm going to say truthfully, because I've used a lot of curved fills, maybe I probably won't want to scale this a whole lot because curved fills have more chance to hiccup than other kinds of fills do. And that's both in processing. It's harder to get an object out of them. It's harder to get stitch processing out of them than it would be a straight fill. So because I have that, I'm going to say probably I'm not going to do a tremendous amount of scaling, but let's say I just want to change the text. Luckily, on this particular design, I look at this design, I can see immediately that this design does not have any sort of cutouts for the details that are under the text. So if I'm trying to see what's under the text, I can see there's no cutouts under the text. It's very easy for me to replace that text with something else then. Because once I get into this piece, I can go ahead and check this out. Here's all my stitch types, my stitch blocks. Obviously, all the text is on one stitch break. If I just want to get rid of the text, and because this doesn't have any of those holes cut out of it, one layer of satin over maybe a layer of fill, maybe sometimes over a piece of a satin border, this is something where with no compunction, I can just grab the design element itself, and either I can grab it and move it out of the way, or I can just delete it and it's fine. So if I'm in my stitch editing, I can delete that and it's fine. There's really no reason to worry too much about that piece. I've now have this little bomb element and I can reuse it. We all know that that's easy enough. The truth of the matter is it's usually easy to do other parts of this too. If we are dealing with any sort of editing software that allows us to select, we can, of course, lock and hide elements of our design. We have just this text here. And let's say bombers is still where I'm going with, but I'm not dealing with these folks from Albuquerque anymore. Well, then I can go into my editing. There's generally some sort of tool that will allow you to lasso stuff in, and I can delete just that portion, and that's fine. This sort of editing, I recommend everybody get used to. And frankly, this sort of editing also can be helpful for doing things with scale. If we are doing something like this where we're not making massive changes to the detail, when we're not trying to do a bunch of work on it that's going to cause this artistic sense of it to go poorly, if we're not messing with shading or individual details like you would have in an engraving style piece, cutting pieces out is not a big deal. And most of the time we're not going to do anything that's going to cause immense damage. And on top of it, even if I did something, let's say I do something that might cause some issues to be had in the piece. Like let's say I've got tie off stitches at the end of this, this streak that's up here at the top. Let's say that is the case, but I want it to be shorter anyway. Even if I select this and delete that stuff, and I've got some outlying stitches, you can, on a lot of different software will allow you to, as we have here in Enthusiast, ensure a tie afterwards, add a tie stitch, add a tie before, or manually jump a couple stitches in there, and you can click them in and create your own ties and lockdowns and tie-ins, tie-outs, and other sorts of pieces. And I'll be honest and say that in a pinch, I will also draw my own underlay. Now, in this case, I don't love doing it in editing software where I'm doing it one stitch at a time. I have done it. What I often do in this case, let's say I need to add underlay to a piece, I will separate out the color breaks, and I will find a place where I can go into my digitizing software and draw in my manual underlay under a piece if I'm having issues where I need that underlay and there's no other way to access it. Or honestly, I'll take this piece out and redigitize it because it's faster. Really depends on what the kind of issue is and whether or not it's something that automated underlay would help under a fully redigitized piece. Something simple like this, I'd probably just replace it. If it's something where I'm having a small gap or I'm having some sort of technical issue with some tearaway, some separation, I may just add a piece of underlay under there. Or if you're lucky enough to have software that does include compensation, and Enthusiast certainly does have compensation you can do on a stitch file, then you can go ahead and grab stitches and do compensation yourself. So let's say we're having some gap issues, and I'll just do the edge of this piece because it's easier for me to select and show you on screen. If you have software like Enthusiast that does this, well, then I can actually compensate that out and make things a little thicker, a little smaller. You can see I accidentally selected an extra stitch up here, but you can now see that that area of the column got thicker. And if I was trying to, let's say, correct a gap with a border, you could do the same thing by selecting the edge of the border and then using the compensation to close those gaps up somewhat. So there are ways that we can do editing that is minor editing that works. We can blow apart a design, reuse elements from it, and then work back into a design. The thing is, that's actually less damaging to the way the design is going to run than scaling. Dropping pieces out and adding pieces in, or as I've often done, let's say I need to scale this piece up for a jacket back, the chances are it might be that if I remove some of the excess shading, if I remove these colors, I may actually be able to use some portion of this design and then create an applique run for it and scale it up. I have done that before. I think for most people, however, the chances are you are going to find massive changes like that aren't going to be worth your time. If you have someone who can do that work for you, or if you can do even basic digitizing, sometimes that is more useful than reworking it. Though I will say that in scaling, when we come up with areas that don't scale well, sometimes what we can do is do the other kinds of blowing up which is to go in here, find areas that we can take out, and then go back into our digitizing software and redigitize our fills, redigitize the elements that we're taking away in the background, and leave other things on top that remain. In a piece this simple, my chances are I'm just going to redigitize the whole thing. But if I was somebody who wasn't a digitizer but had digitizing software, so someone who doesn't feel like they're capable as a complete digitizer, I find that most people could learn how to replace a block of fill. Most people could learn how to replace an element with a piece of applique if they needed to. And I think that that's the kind of thing where if you want to get into basic alteration, you can do it. The truth of the matter is the design was designed for it. Best case scenario is to be working with a digitizer. Second best case scenario, if you have working files, to actually be able to access those objects and to be able to draw and work directly from the objects that are there, so you can do the editing and use the original objects. Let's say I want this now to be a shape to be used for something else. Well, if I want that to be a border or something else now, I can start working from that and working it out. That is a much easier way than redrawing that piece, or than trying to put it together out of segments that it processed it into when I tried to tell the software, hey, make this into objects again. Especially if I've done something like this piece that has some distressing, that has some kind of rough, and you can see that we've got quite a lot of nodes in this piece because we have this kind of distressed, rough look here, and I was kind of altering that curve a lot. The more complexity we have in that line, the less likely it's going to come back into a shape that is easy for us to use. Can it happen sometimes? Yes. It might not always happen. Be prepared when you try and process with object-based software like that you will not get necessarily the objects that are back, or you might end up with 3 or 4 or 5 objects that you now have to fuse or work on to get back something that's usable. So that's blowing up designs, at least as I was talking about it before. The things that are interesting to me, like I said, if we go back through this and kind of just tie it all up, is that we do have to think about what's going to happen, not only in the embroidery considerations, those are those technical considerations. Long stitches that are extra long are going to both jump on our machine. If our machine is set up to trim over a certain length, you might end up with trims that you don't intend if you're not doing any sort of processing. If your software is set up to process for maximum stitch length, then there's chances you're going to change the texture and add extra breaks or splits. But we're also going to have those artistic considerations where if we're doing shading, if we have engraving style work there, there's a high chance of changing how dark that shading is, how far apart it is. And when we have straight lines that are done with hard nodes, even in the object file, or if we're working with stitches where we have short stitches that are not going to alter the curve, they're going to remain those stitches that are there, we're going to get a lot of angles. We're going to get a rougher looking outcome if we scale things up. Or honestly, we scale things at all, but especially when we scale things up, the shading and outline work that we've done is going to look rougher. Also, same thing with straight stitch outlines on things. If we have a straight stitch outline around text or around anything, a straight stitch outline, the number of passes that straight stitch outline makes, how many times it goes around the object, gives us about the thickness that we're going to get out of it. When we scale something up, even from a working file, it's the same thickness for the same number of passes. So what looks fine at a small size, when we blow it up 200%, that outline is now thinner in relation to the items that are there. And we might need to change the stitch type. By the time we're into the point of changing that stitch type, on the working file, there might still be some possibilities. On the stitch file, we're now into reworking, redigitizing, and often the case is that it's better to redigitize yourself, have it redigitized for the scale that you really want it, than to do that amount of editing and blowing up. As it goes to blowing up designs, meaning taking them apart, I'm a great proponent of being able to take your designs apart and use different elements. In this case, though, best case scenario is to have design software or editing software that allows you to lasso, loop, or select stitches and delete them out. Other software can work that doesn't do that. You can add color stops, you can break things out, and it's totally possible and doable if you're doing it a lot, if you're working with a lot of stock designs and you're going to be separating things out, reusing elements, cutting elements from a design and reusing them somewhere else. And these are all from stitch files. Get yourself editing software that not only is conscious of those stitches, but allows you to select them individually and manipulate them more easily. Gold standard is always going to be having it done correctly for the right element. But when we want to reuse an element, we want to take a star off of a flag and use it for something, there's no reason not to, especially if we're keeping it at the same scale that it was, because by far, rescaling a design is more likely to damage or at least alter the outcome that the digitizer had in mind at the original scale. than taking it apart. Taking it apart and layering it all back together, especially if you're using software that handles some of that density and layering, or you're just being very careful with what you're stacking together, is not going to be as devastating to a file as certainly scaling it will be. Scaling it is certainly quite a bit harder to handle and to make work well. So with that, let's get on to the next topic. I wanted to talk a little bit, as we said previously, about digitizing prep. So why do I have all these elements here? We see the Duke City stuff in the middle where I've talked about this particular design before. You can see that the original piece there was pretty rough and I had to recreate it. The reason why I showed that piece is because it's one example of digitizing prep. The reason why I talk about digitizing prep in this way, looking at this original design and redrawing it, is because I think that my attitude toward digitizing prep might be different than a lot of folks. I think that if you come from a fairly old school method, if you come from an old school digitizing method, the chances are you were very used to, at the least, let's say you're in my boat, you're not all the way back to where we were drawing the architectural versions of things. We're doing the cartooning. We're not doing the magnetic board on the wall where we're doing 6:1 scaling. Let's say we're in the era of scanners. We're in the era of dealing with, at the very least, scanned printed materials. Most of us are very used to using a raster graphic, so like a JPEG, like a bitmap, something that's made out of pixels, not vectors, and drawing our elements on top of it. So much so that we really don't consider, or we're not likely to start into a design by bringing in vector graphics and trying to convert shapes. So I've talked about this before. It's why I put stuff in the links list. I see lots of folks coming in and having issues with designs, not because the designs are particularly difficult or not because they don't understand the software, but because they have a tendency not to want to redraw, not to want to edit the shapes, or they're envisioning the art that they brought in, especially vector art. They're bringing in SVG, they're bringing in whatever vector art they have, and they're envisioning objects in the art and thinking of them as the entire object rather than the result. And this is what I mean by this. If you have an outlined hand, and I know my green screen is probably making my hand look a little weird here. We have an outlined hand, and let's say I have my fingers closed here. Some people will think about drawing the outline of the hand such. They'll draw around all the edges, down in between the fingers, and they'll draw those lines, and that will be one line that they've drawn. Frequently enough, it'll be that way, or they'll bring in a vector that has it drawn this way, where the hand is here, or maybe the fingers are slightly spread. So in a vector or a printed piece of art, in that stock design, they've got a line on every edge, and it goes in between every finger, as you would imagine, right? That's part of how it can be done. The thing is, at the thickness of the stitch they want to put on that edge, when we get down between the fingers, especially when they're close together, we're now, if we convert this entire outline to a standard monoline, input C, satin column, whichever it's called in your design software, in your digitizing software, now we have two lines of satin that are completely on top of each other that don't belong, where we're having extra density in between that area because we're thinking of that line as an object that should stay that way. When what we're really not looking at is the fields of color, and I'm considering the outline as part of that. The fields of color we're trying to represent in this object. Even in a simple thing like a hand, we're looking at that sort of problem. We look at those objects and we imagine them as the object they are, or to some degree, and I'll show you more of this as talking about that prep, and I've shown you this before, you'll have a design where somebody who's designing for print has made the outline a slab. So we have a big, thick outline around the entire hand, but what it really is there's a full slab of color that has a contour outside of the edge of the hand that is entirely behind all of the area of the hand here. And so we have a full slab of color and then another full slab of color that represents the hand itself. When we convert those things without doing any sort of work to it, if we just literally assign stitches to that, we can end up with massive overlaps. We can end up with borders that don't make sense. We can end up with objects where, let's say, the hand is drawn as a separate thing to the arm, but because the color meshes between the two pieces, we actually have two objects that you can't see unless you're looking in wireline mode. And you might end up where we are putting a border that goes around the bottom of the hand that isn't visible in the printed vector art. When we think of the vector objects as all we need, we have a tendency to shortchange ourselves for what the embroidery needs. The embroidery frequently needs objects that are not present in the vector. And I know if you've been with me for a long time, you've heard me harp on this before, but I'm seeing it so much more frequently now that I think it bears talking about. That for those of us who digitized from scans, who digitized from physical art that was brought in, that option wasn't there unless we did a redraw ourselves. And even if we did a redraw, we understood that we were drawing art that was meant as a template, meant as something for us to look at, while we're doing our digitizing. It was not the end result. It was definitely not the shape we needed for embroidery. We knew we're going to do something in vector art. And honestly, the original software wasn't bringing that vector art in any way that we could actually process it. And then we were working on top of that art. So when I talk about digitizing prep in this case, I want to discuss kind of this dichotomy just a little bit. The concept of convert versus redraw. And you probably have heard me talk about this before. In fact, I know if you've been following the show for some time, you definitely have heard it. But this is where a lot of people get tied up. The conversion versus the redraw, even when they have vector, even when they understand things like start and stop points, stitch inclinations, underlay to some degree. I mean, we're reaching when we're talking about somebody who's brand new to the work of digitizing. When they understand those elements of embroidery, they still may not kind of understand fully, or may feel like they're doing work they don't need to do when they bring in vector. They feel like the vector should be enough to work from, and they start adding start and stop points. They start adding inclination lines, and then find themselves very frustrated when they're working with extremely complex shapes that don't process exactly the way we want them to, or when they just find that things don't automatically handle things like overlapping elements and what have you. The truth of the matter is, this is the convert versus redraw method. And like I said, why did I show you these kind of awful designs that I've worked on before? It's because obviously, if you're doing something like this is probably not the problem for you. You might say, okay, well, of course, Eric, you're working from a piece of embroidery which is bad. And I know I hate to say this because somebody did this piece, and I don't want them to feel poorly about it. But this is what was presented to me. And honestly, I think this was probably scaled up from another piece at some point or edited because of the way the textures were put together in this thing. But this is the piece that was brought to me for replication. As we see, it's on the back of a chambray shirt, which is pretty light for this much stitching in the first place. If I show you the final piece, you'll see that I actually used an applique to allow me to do some really light stitching underneath that central circle, so we didn't have that same issue. And I did this actually on a piece of performance wear that worked pretty well. But it was a really big design, right? So it's not a small design. It's not huge, but it's not a small design. It's a fairly large piece. And you can see that it has fared poorly, both because the stability in the design itself wasn't great. But if we look at the way this thing is done, we've got this 45-degree angle. So we're weak on the material. It's going to stretch that material and pucker it quite a lot. And you can see no puckers down here in the bottom right quadrant. We have puckers in the left. Well, here's our stitch angle. What is that doing? The stitches are all pulling along that angle, and it's drawing this material in, causing all this puckering. And this is when I've got it stretched in a hoop. So I have got this stretched tight in a hoop. I'm trying not to let it go too far off of the line of the text, but no matter which way I stretch it, this thing is so mangled by the time that I get it that this is as good as I can get. When I'm looking at the original prints that they had, this is all they had for this particular piece of art. But when I'm looking at the stuff that they had and I talked to them about it, they had this and like business cards and pens. So we're talking about extremely poor art with really small renditions. Well, I decided I'm going to redraw it. I talked to them about it. Yes, it's supposed to be a real circle. I'm drawing it in vector. But still, here's the problem. Even with this piece, this vector doesn't actually represent all of the shapes that I would need. If we're looking at this, this is overlaid. This has outlines applied to it. This has strokes applied to it. And this still doesn't represent the objects I need. We understand, even looking at this piece, you know that the stroke in this D, the vertical stroke is not going to be completely attached to this curve, this hook of the D as well. This cup is not going to be one piece. We're going to have two satin stitches in it. So when we're dealing with this piece, you know that I don't have those objects. With text, it makes more sense to folks, because if we look at least at example text, we look at fonts that are in our software, we look at other embroidered text, we can tell that we have multiple satin stitches being used that have different angles, different start and stop points, that are not one element, one item, and that they're overlapped. When we run them, we can see they're made of multiple pieces. In this case, these big slab serifs, if it's going to be a satin stitch font, we're going to have individual satins for the serifs, individual satins for the strokes, and we're going to bring these together and overlap them in such a way that they're attractive. That's what we're going to do. And in this case, we're also going to have a satin stitch border on this lettering, and those borders are going to be applied thereafter. We know that these shapes are not what we need for the digitizing. So what am I going to do with this vector? Even if I bring it into my software as vector, I'm going to lock it down and start drawing the shapes that I actually need. So even if I'm working with vector, I'm going to have to go back in and create the shapes that I actually need, punch things out where they need to be punched out, separate things that need to be separated. And frankly, depending on the complexity of the design, I'm going to do a lot of that redrawing in the digitizing software because of kind of how I came into this work. For me, This work started from scanning in things not unlike this. Mostly they were cleaner than this. Certainly, this work is not where I'd want to be. In this case, this one is so distorted that I made a perfected version in vector so that I've got a perfect circle that I can really lay out and get things aligned correctly. I'm going to do that in vector art software in this case. I could do it in digitizing software. Most digitizing software has vector art tools either built in or partnered with it. However, in this case, I brought it out to vector software, drew it out myself with simple shapes, with a font that is obviously the original model for the font that was done here, and I created it from that. But at no time do I expect that these shapes that are here, will I be able to just assign a stitch type to them and run and end up with the best embroidered result. I know that I'm going to do some redrawing. So that's kind of the argument here. It's the redraw versus, it's the redraw versus the conversion. And certainly I'll show you the finished piece one more time just to kind of let you see what ended up from this. But in this case, I replaced the background with an applique that I did a light density fill over just to show you what was done. And yes, this is on a performance mesh, so it was just as big as that other piece. Not the choice I would have necessarily made for myself, but customers choose what they choose. And this is how that was eventually rendered. I couldn't have gotten that render without doing the redraw. At the same time, if you look at the piece, you can tell, of course, that I'm not using an exact facsimile. I'm not just converting the pieces that are there in that original design into stitches. And in this case, this piece you could get pretty close, but it doesn't have everything I need, and that's not something that's contentious. When we're dealing with something that's incredibly detailed, then it's very obvious that that's not going to work out. And actually, I'm going to show you one of the other original pieces from that other design. I showed you that Chambers design earlier. Well, if I use the vector from this design, it's fairly obvious it's not going to contain everything I need. But part of that issue, too, is that I'm not expecting it to, and I'm not going to work on it like I'm getting that vector out. If we go into this design, you can see that this is probably auto-processed from something else. This was not drawn in vector for cleanliness. This was probably processed down from some anatomical drawing that was originally scanned out. I think there were certain elements that were probably drawn, but most of this is probably from stock art of some kind, because I see a lot of little artifacts. We look in here, even in the areas that are red, we're looking at a bunch of different artifacts. You can kind of see these little outlines that are appearing. Well, we have elements in these that don't make sense. We have some red pieces on red. We have things that are colored strangely. We're obviously getting some really wonky nodes and shapes. And if we zoom out on this piece, you're going to see that attempting to use any amount of this thing, even though it's flattened, even though it doesn't have a big slab, trying to make any of that into embroidery directly or assigning anything to that is just not going to result in shapes that are useful to us. We can see that in the piece that I ended up with, I've separated elements out. I've overlapped multiple satin stitches to make some of these areas. And certainly as I'm into these, very much like the hand element I talked about earlier, I'm going to do things to go into these nooks and crannies and break up those satin stitches. I can actually show you that too. We can jump into software on that original piece, and let's jump back out and look at this element. Now, certainly it's much smaller, has much less detail than that original piece, but we can see into those satins that in this case, I have a satin element here that is separate. It starts out here. We've got a satin element that goes underneath this from the top. This second element tracks back up from here, and it dovetails into this element that's layered on top of it, that then goes into this element that has a manually mitered corner here, you could say. It's not exactly mitered, but it is underneath this second portion of the outline that then goes on beyond it down to this element. So as we're working on this piece, we're breaking it up, and we have those objects that are meant to be there. In this case, the original was flattened, so I didn't have things that I had to cut out myself. It was flattened, but at the same time, everything was one piece. The thin lines have to be separated from the satins, have to be separated from everything else. With detailed things, it seems easier to get people to kind of accept that to some degree. But at the same time, when people are working from something like that, the simple piece I showed you earlier, the Duke City piece, they may look at that vector. If I had given them that vector and it was all flattened out for print, they would probably be more likely to try and convert that out instead of thinking that the individual rays had to be satin stitches that were separate elements from other portions of the design. So that's what I'm talking about when I'm saying design prep. There's different ways to look at digitizing and digitizing prep. And I think it's about not just the convert versus redraw, but it's about thinking about what art is for embroidery, what art is for digitizing. In the case that I want to make massive changes to my art, I'm not expecting that to happen in the digitized file. So even in this case, like let's say we're talking about, we can talk about it in the realm of that chambers design again. That's fine. That is a fine way to discuss it. But if we're talking about this design again, if I was going to go in and I wanted to change the placement of this lettering on this heart, like I was talking about before, if that's what I was trying to do, I would not digitize the whole thing and then start moving around this stuff with a customer. I'm not going to then grab all of my lettering for this and try and make that work out. I'm not going to grab this piece and start moving it up and finding the place where it's going to be with the customer there. I'm going to do that work on this file. I'm going to go into here. Now, in this case, this file is a bad example, certainly because it has things that are cut out, it's flattened down, it's been done from a piece that was obviously scanned in. But even then, before I get into digitizing, even though this is a detailed piece and can be difficult to work with, it's a lot easier to do the redrawing, to put color where it needs to be in vector software, in art software, and then work from there. You want to have an approval from your client on the general layout of stuff, or even if you're working for yourself, the general layout should be done in the art, in my opinion, should be done in the art before it goes to the digitizing stage, or you should still be working on the art portion, not the stitches portion of this thing by the time you get there, because there's an immense amount of time put in to splitting up the areas that are in the art into the stitch blocks that you intend to have, into setting up the different settings for the stitch blocks, into making that look the way it should look for you. So that's the thing, the texturing, the separating, the dimension that you put into it. In this case, this piece does have a lot of extra detail, but if I was working with one big slab of red here, I can move areas around in that or overlap different pieces, especially say that piece we talked about earlier that I showed you, the Duke City piece. I was allowed to move around all of the different elements while I still had everything overlapped. I hadn't cut out any areas to prevent density issues. I hadn't made any alterations that were specific to the embroidery process. If I want to go in and change shapes on the original art, it's a simpler process that's not going to cause me to reassign stitches that might change the way that I make decisions about the interpretation into embroidery. So like I said, it's not something that is one-to-one. You have a super simple design in SVG that you can bring in and run. You're doing engraving style work that just has an outline. You're doing an outlined letter, something simple that doesn't have a lot that you'll have to change to make it work for embroidery. This may not be a big issue for you. Do your layout in your software and change it as you go. That's not a big deal. If you're doing complicated work where you may have to cut out voids, you may have to make alterations, you may have to manually break up outlines into different shapes, do engraving style work like I showed you, do shading. That sort of stuff should be the embroidery interpretation phase in my point. And I think that most of the art changes should be done before we get there. And I think that comes from an era that is kind of a bridge between the original era. The first era of embroidery digitizing, punching, is where someone has taken the art, they've interpreted it from embroidery, it's all prepped, and the digitizer is just in the way of making stitches be where they should be. They really haven't even made a ton of decisions at that point. Those digitizers, those punchers, aren't making the same number of decisions as the person who's prepping the art at that case. And that's really far off. Now that's where everything is separated, where there is a designer who's done their work, that's already done. Then there is someone who's doing the cartooning, that's already done, and the decisions made about stitches. And then there's punching, and the punching is done where we're dropping stitches in there, and you're not necessarily making decisions as much as someone who is doing design work, certainly, especially not making design decisions. Then in the phase that I kind of come into it, if you're in a small shop and you're doing a certain amount of design work and alteration, if I'm making recommendations to a customer or I'm making a design for myself and I'm trying to figure out layout, if I'm trying to figure out shapes, if I'm making mass alterations to color, or say I'm in a gradient, I'm changing where in the gradient a color shows up, that is stuff that is extremely hard in comparison, or is much harder to handle and alter once I'm working in stitches. I want to do all of that design level decision making before I get to embroidery. And also, in the case that you're working with customers, if we have to make alterations to the art that are pertinent to the embroidery, and it's going to take a long time to do digitizing, but we know we have to make those changes to the art, this gives us a chance to redraw the art, show the art, and say to the customer, this is what I'm going to be interpreting. Is this gross layout, just the layout, just the way things are arranged, the way the colors are, the way that the elements are put together, is this what you want? Does it make sense to you? Doing that prep ahead of time means that by the time we're into the digitizing process, we're concerned with embroidery. We're concerned with the way the embroidery works. We're not concerned as much with the layout and design phase. We have things laid out the way they should be. Text is the size it's going to be. The customer knows what the overall size and what the size of the elements will be and how that kind of interfaces with where they're placing it on a garment. And then we get to the digitizing phase that is all about interpretation, all about making the best embroidered result. So it really depends on, like I said, it depends on how you feel about that. I think you can do art work in the digitizing software. You can do that, and more as we have digitizing software. I mean, in Stitch Artist, there is definitely vector tools and the ability to work on vector elements. You can alter art in that place. I think that doing that vision work, the work of design, should probably be done before we start putting stitches on something. And certainly, you're going to have a lot more trouble if you think of these interchangeable pieces and think that as designs, you're just going to slap things together, move text around on top of a background. If you have something that is going to require, because of the embroidery needs, the technical needs, for you to cut out holes behind something, for you to alter the sequence of things to make sure that they run right. Let's say we're working on caps. Let's say we have different layering that has to be done to make something work right for dimension, or we have processes or we have color stops that have to be in a certain way, or maybe we're working with multimedia or applique. We could really alter a lot of different shapes. And as we know with applique, there's multiple shapes that go into making an applique piece. If we already exported any of this stuff, we have to go back and regenerate everything if we start moving the positions of things in relation to each other. So for my money, I'm just saying I would think of the embroidery process, or at least of the embroidery design process for me. If we include digitizing as part of the design process, we're making a design that is going to end up as an embroidered piece. I would imagine it as design work, getting things right, and understanding what the design is going to look like. If there are alterations for the embroidery process, but they're still in the art phase, then we are making those alterations to the art, to the vector, to the graphic, and we're making sure those make sense. Then we're in the digitizing phase. If we find that we have to make alterations there, fine, but we should have made most of our design level decisions. What does our font look like? What size is it in relation to stuff? Where does it appear? What colors are where mostly, especially if we're doing things that require shading or anything where we're going to actually have to draw objects to represent the shading elements, to represent what we're trying to get out of it. Then we do the digitizing and the embroidery. That's what we're looking for. There's a separation there. And I think we don't, at least I don't like the concept of digitizing before I've worked out the art for most things. For logo style work, especially for this kind of work, for graphical work, I want the graphics done first. Certainly, I will fully admit, if I'm doing things that are made for decorative stitching, there is a place for creating embroidery in the embroidery software. And I often like to work into the embroidery for things like sometimes like borders or laces or decorative stitching, something where the thread is the thing, the embroidery is the thing. Sometimes that is super hard to work on in the vector style. For logos and graphics and images that we're representing, most of that design work should be done in the design process, if not in other software, certainly before we get into adding a lot of stitch types to the design. So like I said, it depends on what you're working on. I'll certainly say combining different elements into a finished design is something that I think you should have the combinations worked out before you get to the digitizing process. And for sure, not something to expect that you're going to be able to move anything anywhere and have it turn out perfectly. You're very likely going to have to make decisions and change things. And sometimes gross alterations may require you to recreate a design. So design prep, one of those things. I had some people who had some issues with that, or at the very least were having issues with reworking into their designs because of that. And I think part of that is just mindset, that we should pretty well know what the embroidery is going to look like. Maybe not the textures, maybe not exactly the stitch types, maybe not exactly everything that we're going to interpret, but we should know what the finished image would look like, aside from those embroidery textures, those decisions that are specific to embroidery, before we get there. We should know what the design looks like before we get there. Certainly you can design in the software. It's a choice you can make, but you're more likely to have, if not catastrophic rework, where we really have to take something apart and do a lot of work to replace it. You're going to be doing more work to get it done if you don't do the design phase first, in my opinion. So like I said, that's an opinion thing to some degree, but I think it's pretty well backed up by my years and years of experience, knowing that if I made a design choice without asking and had to correct that design choice once the embroidery design was entirely done, the digitizing was going to take me a lot longer than it would have taken me to prep the vector and show somebody an image before I started. All right. So the last little topic I'm going to talk about very briefly, as I said previously, was to talk about a cap problem someone was having, and just very, very quickly to go over a little bit about caps, or a little bit about the specific type of cap we're talking about, and issues that I encountered and how I handled them. Certainly we could talk about other stuff. I originally had wanted to go deeper into the vector redrawing thing, showing you the difference between, vector objects versus what we actually draw and how many pieces are there. This is something I've talked about before. Go check out that episode where I discuss vector redrawing. There's a lot of articles that I've written about this, the process of redrawing things and how many objects actually go into creating a piece. But the caps thing I want to cover briefly before we get out of here, so that I don't entirely miss the stuff I said I would tell everybody. And frankly, I think that there's some good stuff to discuss there. So like I said previously, this stuff is interesting. It's stuff that we can talk about, but by all means, not everybody has the same needs or the same stuff that they're working on. In any case, I'll very briefly go over the cap elements, the stuff that I'm talking about. Mostly what this had to do with was some low profile hats, some unstructured hats that were causing people problems. The truth of the matter is, these cap conundrums, most of the time when we're dealing with caps, the top thing we're dealing with is the lack of stability. Caps, by their very nature and by the nature of the way we address them, they don't have the kind of stability. They don't have the kind of dimensional stability that we have on a flat design on hooped fabric. Hooped fabric is stretched at all extremes. It is arrested from moving in any one given direction mostly, and that's going to mean that it holds up to the stresses of embroidery better. It's just the truth. Caps are going to have a tendency to not hold up to it as much. And the couple of problems that I saw recently that I saw in my inbox had to do with both unstructured hats and how to run on those. And I had some issues with people who were having textural issues with hats, where we're getting kind of strange results. And those strange results have to do with the construction of the hat. And we're having a difference. And this is where the conundrum comes in, the thing that causes people to have issues in figuring this stuff out. A difference between a design run on a flat sample piece and a design run on an actual cap that's being used. And these conundrums are fairly easy to suss out. First one, I'm just going to briefly talk about one of the pieces that I actually showed here earlier on the space we have in front of you. You see on the bottom left-hand side, we have a really large kind of gear icon that was done on a unstructured hat. This thing is huge. It's going up into the eyelets. The truth of the matter is, your design has a lot to do with whether the cap's going to run well. And in this case, a really large single color design isn't going to have the same kind of issues with stability that you're going to have when you're trying to do outlining and detail work on the same hat, because we don't register anything. You may still see some distortion, but it might be acceptable. On a really simple design, on a single color, you do a really large design on a hat, and you might find that it's okay. That distortion may not bother you depending on the design. On that design, it has a big round gear with a skull in the center. If there's a little bit of stretch, a little bit of movement, it's not going to be that difficult to kind of forgive. So the problem is, if someone says to you, I can make a design that's 3.5 inches tall on that hat, depending on the design, depending on the setup of the design itself, it may not really be a good analog. If you did the same thing, but it was an intensely detailed seal, let's say it's the seal of the US president, and we have an eagle with a fistful or a talon full of arrows, and we have a branch, and we have all these little pieces and shields and stripes and feathers. We have a lot of outlining that has to hit. We have a lot of registration. We have multiple colors. These forces that are on the hat and all of the little details, and then thousands upon thousands more times we have to drop that needle, are going to cause more distortion than the design I just showed you that was a single color piece. So if someone just says, hey, I can see that that's going way up into the eyelets, it's going to run correctly, well, that may not be the case, right? That may not be the issue. And by the way, I love this, Justin. New hashtag for hat design issues, hashtag cap conundrum, please. By all means, hashtag cap conundrums. Let's talk about cap problems. But here's the thing. It's not always apples to apples. There is an apples to oranges problem. If you do a large single color monogram that goes way up into the eyelets of the hat, As long as that thing isn't massively distorted, small distortions in a large monogram like that are going to be more forgivable than small distortions that cause an outline to go off on a multicolor outlined graphical design. So that's the first thing I want to say, is that when people are comparing their work and someone says, how high can you go on a hat? And they show you a single color monogram that's done huge, that is way huge. And also the hat has been hooped flat and glued to within an inch of its life to a flat piece and then run. Or if we see a piece that's done as a panel program, if someone has created the hat after the panels were stitched, the way that those stresses are applied to that material and the way that they're being arrested by the hoop are very different than if you are on a cylindrical frame on a 270 with that hat floating on it and rotating. That is a very different environment than a flat panel that was stitched before. Or it's also very different if you have a multicolor design that has a lot going on and a lot of little details and outlines than if you have a big single color design like that. Because I just showed you that design looks good and it's way up into the crown on that really soft unstructured hat. That's not always going to be the case. It's not that you can't make an unstructured hat run well. It's that you do have to compare with people. If they're showing you a design that's 4 inches tall all the way up to the top, and they've smashed it flat and it's only working inside the area that they could get glued down, they're going to have a very different reaction to how these things are going to work. And also, I'm going to actually tell you this, having worked with someone who did all of their, they did children's hats that they were smashing flat like that. Worked very well for single colors. They were using an adhesive tearaway backing to make that happen. When that backing had too much detail run in a certain area, it would start to fall apart. And as the stabilizer fell apart, the backing fell apart, that design started to come apart, and multicolor designs especially had a tendency to start to wander and lose cohesion, because as the stabilizer gets chewed up by tons and tons of work through a certain area, it starts to lose its ability to arrest the cap in front, and then it started to wander and move around under the needle. It really depends on the design you're working on. It depends on the hat, the stabilizer, and how else you're doing it. I mean, honestly, that is why sometimes on a hat like that, on a hat that has very little stability, I definitely have known folks who use a cutaway. And I know thinking about cutting away a stabilizer inside a hat is crazy. Depending on the design that you're working on, if you have a hat that has absolutely no stability to it and an incredibly detailed design, and you can't convince them to put a patch on the front, let me preface it with that, you can have issues where the density and the detail and the amount of work you're doing into that stabilizer may not hold up with a traditional type of stabilizer. It just is a thing that can happen. So you have to realize that we still have to arrest that motion in some way. Certainly, hooping straight, making sure that the teeth are where they are supposed to be on the hat, that the front teeth are under this band, underneath that seam. They fall right into that. I mean, I'm wearing a military style hat. This is a district houndstooth military hat that is going out of style, but mine is not the same as a 6-panel hat, but you have those teeth right inside that gutter. And then the other teeth that are on the other side are just above the side seam. And so that seam stays straight and it stays in the level plane. A lot of the problems people have with things creeping up and down on the hat where they're having angular issues are because the hat's just not hooped correctly or just not hooped firmly, and the teeth on the straps are not lining up where they should be. That's a portion of it. Certainly the other portion of it is stability, it's stabilizer. And I'm just going to say, this is something I've done. It is not necessarily for every hat, but it is something I've done when I'm dealing with really difficult hats. I've done the full backing ring, right? The full stabilizer ring. When I have a hat that is extremely unstable and I'm working on a 270-degree frame and I'm finding that as I get up into the vertical, the heights of what this hat can handle, I'm having a bunch of issues with stability. I'm having a bunch of issues with registration. Using a full ring of stabilizers that goes from post to post, as you can see in this image here, we're going from post to post, from the rear post all the way around the front to the other post. Now I have some vertical stability and I'm essentially making a sort of cylinder out of stabilizer that will hold the hat up. It's not the answer for everything, but I've had this work for me on hats that were causing a lot of stability problems, both on some structured hats that had so many issues with working on the side. Once we go from the structure of the crown off to the side that is essentially an unstructured panel, this allows the side to have a lot of structure. So on a wide format hat, it allows me to go off into that area and have a complete structure. Plus, we have to realize on a 270-degree frame like this, the only vertical stability, the only element it has that is vertically stable are those posts on the side. Those are the place where you can anchor to give something some vertical stability. If you do the full ring of stabilizer, you're making, I mean, imagine an old school oatmeal box. You are making a cylinder out of this thing that has a little bit of strength to it. And I found that when we're having a lot of difficulty on the sides of hats, or when we're working on something unstructured that really has problems with coming apart, not having a lot of stability, we can use the full ring to help us build stability. And then we use underlay, careful attachment of underlay, to make sure that our hat itself is married to that stabilizer before we run the top stitching. It's not always possible to do it with every element or with every design, but we can usually find some place to put some straight stitching to tack that crown to our stabilizer before we start applying a bunch of stress with our top stitching. So like I said, it's not necessarily the answer for everything. It is an answer that I've had help me out many times. And certainly you have to be careful with how you do this stuff. If you look at this design that's here, and I'll go ahead and blow this up one more time so you can have a look at it. When I'm talking about those teeth, I cannot tell you how many times somebody says they can't get very far down on their hat and they're way up into the crown. And this is what I see. I see the strap up into the crown, and I've got a bubble of material that is from the front of the hat that is inside under the strap that is sticking out, and the strap is not all the way down and the bill is too far down. Making sure the placement of those teeth of that strap is correct is a big deal. And also cap backs, though definitely in recent years, many more jigs have been made available and clamps have been made available to the cap backs. And those cap back clamps are awesome. I've seen those before. If you're just doing a small name or small text over something, there's no reason you can't use a stock hoop. This is how I used to do all of my work. Yes, it's an old school way of doing it, but this is an old school way that has worked for me very well. And it allows you to do logo work that's up into that area. If you've got something that's kind of vertical or that doesn't have to be too wide up into the top of the curve here, we can do some small logo work. We can do easy text work over that hoop, and we get a nice flat cap back arch. But certainly if you're having trouble with stability, think about this issue. Think about the potential, at least, of especially on 270s, especially when we're working with something that doesn't have any sort of vertical stability closer to the front. Think about using the full ring of stabilizer. If you have to have that cut yourself, that is one thing. You can get full ring stabilizer straps like this, pre-cuts, but at the same time, when we're working with caps that are that difficult, that are causing us those immense stability problems, or we have designs that are really tearing that stability up, sometimes something like this, though it seems kind of extreme, can help. People often just slide a very small piece of stabilizer into the crown, and it's really not attached to anything except for right here at the base strap. And for me, that's just not a lot of attachment. If we're thinking about the stabilizers trying to arrest motion, trying to arrest stretch, the nature of the stabilizer itself, the stabilizer being stiff and not stretchy, helps quite a lot. But if we're only putting a small piece right in the front of the hat, right under our design area, it can shift quite a bit, and it's really only being held by the bottom strap that's holding it into the piece, aside from once we start stitching it together. But when we first get it put into the place and we're starting to apply stress to it, it doesn't really have a lot of structure to itself. And when our hat doesn't have a lot of structure, there's really not a lot going on there to keep it from moving or shifting. This can help with that shifting. Like I said, not an answer for everything, can be an answer for the worst of the worst, can be an answer for super light hats that don't hold up. The other problem I had to deal with the cap conundrum is something that certainly it's something that I've dealt with previously and talked about, is that not all caps are made the same. If you want to go look at this, certainly dealing with the kind of sequencing of caps is another way we can handle our stability. But when I talk about not all caps being made the same, part of it is the structure inside of the hat and the structure of the material itself. This is one of the ones I wanted to talk about. If you look at hats, some hat materials, breathable mesh style hats can have some texture on the tops. This can cause the same kind of issues we would see with texture on shirts or on any other garment, where we have some sawtoothing at the edge and some detail stuff. In this case, this is really zoomed in and I don't see a ton of texture. But if you have a customer or you yourself are concerned with those kinds of things, you can end up where you've got a little bit of texture, a little bit of sawtoothing, and you might want to look at either underlay or how you're stitching these to try and shore that up and not have quite as much textural trouble. But the other thing we often deal with happens to be how the cap's put together itself. When I've seen someone who's dealing with that dichotomy between, I ran this on a piece of flat material and it's looking great, and now I'm running on this cap and it just looks terrible, and it's not shifting, everything's still staying in place, they've got their hat where it needs to be, it's not, the sequence is great, all that's there, but they're having edge quality issues. Sometimes it really is the hat. And I know somebody's going to say to me, well, we should be able to stitch any hat with anything, and that should be it. And I would say, yeah, to a degree, but the hat can affect your quality of the edge, especially your stitch quality, your edge quality can be affected by the materials that are used in the hat. Um, yes, we use sharps. Yes, we can use uh, not only sharps, but we can use titaniums. We can use thicker ones to try and avoid needle deflection, to try and punch through the hat. That's fine. There are certain materials that are going to cause a little bit of needle tracking. And when you see extremely heavy, extremely coarse plastic buckrams or other stability materials in the crown of the hat, you can sometimes look and see directly where your needle is tracking on one side or the other of this mesh. And so you end up with a pixelated looking edge. So the edge of a satin stitch, the edge of a letter ends up stair stepped and looking almost like it was pixelated or jagged. If we look inside the hat and you can see very distinctly where your needle is tracking on some part of that grid of the stabilizing mesh, whatever material they're using inside of the hat to stabilize the front of the crown, you may want to look for a different hat. There are just some hats I've encountered in my career. And I'm not going to name names on brands here because there's multiple different ones and they're made differently over the years. But I've encountered hats in my career that no matter the needle I threw at it, I'm at the, I'm throwing a titanium 9012 sharp at it, and it is still deflecting that needle. It is still causing issues. And frankly, on some of these, especially with some of the materials that tend to shatter, really, they turn to dust, they pulp. When I'm jamming that sharp needle through them over and over again, you'll see this plastic dust that'll appear on the front of the hat sometimes. There are certain support materials that cause the needle to track left and right or up and down around that mesh, that grid inside the hat. When you're having a hat that does that reliably, that consistently is giving you that sawtooth thing, that pixelation, that edge, it's time to look for new hats to offer to people or to turn them down sometimes. Because if you've got a customer who both requires, demands sharp, fine, clean edges and brings you horrific hats, really some of the times it's just the best thing you can do to try and get into a different hat that doesn't have that kind of support material. Unless there is an absolute, necessity to use a hat that runs poorly like that, I would wholeheartedly recommend trying to find them an alternative because you will continue to suffer from that. And things like small text, small columns, and the edges of satins are going to continuously be moving around, wiggling, looking rough, looking distressed. And if that's not okay with your customer, your client, the best thing we can do is get them somewhere else. And I have to say this, as much as, like Aaron says, hats, ugh, love to hate them. I did tons and tons of hats in my time. And most of the time I didn't have that kind of trouble. The thing is, once in a while, I would encounter something that just didn't run well. And what that usually meant is more thread breaks for me, more spoilage, and those things that cause a lot of trouble. Those things have a tendency to cause a lot of, not only just destruction of the hat itself and disruption in the design, they cause issues between the customer and myself when I have to either redo the work, slow down the work, or under deliver because we can't get many hats through that don't have some sort of spoilage, especially if they're being very particular about those edge qualities. So I'll agree with Ramona here. In this case, educate and provide options to your customers. Make sure that you are running the kind of hats that are going to run for you reliably. That's part of your profit margin, is knowing what to run. If you're doing customer supplied work all the time, it's something to discuss with them. When they bring something in, you should check in the garments that they're bringing to you and have a look at them and make sure there are no showstoppers. Because you may find it's not even something like that. It might not be that the thing is made out of materials that you don't like. It might also just be that the pieces themselves have a feature or a function that causes issues. I've had people bring customer supplied hats that had either novelty or other sorts of materials added to them. Maybe they had lights or they had grommets or they had something that was added to them that literally interfered with the process of getting them hooped up, getting them on the cap frame. And when that happens, we have to be able to discuss it with the customer and say, yes, I know you like this hat. Yes, I know you want whatever novelty thing is stapled to it. But the truth of the matter is I can't get this through the machine and I can't put the design where you want it. What can we do instead? And it may be, if you're lucky enough to be running, heat press and you've got a nice hat heat press, maybe we're into making patches. Maybe we're doing heat seal. Maybe we're doing some sort of other decoration, or maybe we're choosing a different hat. And especially when we're talking about this particular problem that I have seen repeatedly, when we have that extremely dense, extremely tough support material that causes those needles to track, even when we're running sharps, even when we're running a thick shank needle, it really makes sense to try and avoid running those, because the truth of the matter is you're going to reduce your profit margins through things like thread breaks and spoilage no matter what. So they're not worth running. It's better to lose that job than to continue running on something that's going to break thread, cause issues, and cause spoilage. Gary asks another question here, which I'm going to say, he says, what do you think about foam front caps for embroidery? I've seen it done well. It's not my favorite kind of embroidery because it has a tendency to cause almost a debossed looking effect. It will sink into the foam front a little bit. So they're not my favorite all the time. But it's not that you can't do it. What I will say is some foam front that's not adhered, married to a twill or to a fabric. I've seen, because there's two kinds of foam front. There's foam front that has something adhered to it. And then there's the kind of foam front that really is very soft, very spongy and loose. You will very likely have to slow your machine down and increase things like your compensation in order to get them to run the way you want to, because you're going to have stitches sinking in, and you're going to certainly see, let's say you have open work, you have an engraving style piece or a single color piece, you're going to see the stitches sinking in and some sort of kind of raising or embossed look or debossed look to elements in the design. So it really depends on what the customer likes for it. I don't love the foam fronts myself, but it's not that they're bad. And also, truth of the matter is, if somebody loves old school 5-panel hats, that's fantastic to not have a big seam down the center. So I would probably argue that a 5-panel hat that's not a foam front would be fine by me, as much as those are a very particular look that not everybody likes, those extremely high profile hats. But the foam front hats, they can cause more distortion. So get ready to test your designs, get extra foam fronts in, and know that you may have to slow down a little bit and adjust your designs, adjust your compensation for the increased kind of crush that can happen on a softer foam fronted hat. Just something you're going to see. And certainly the texture and debossed nature, even when it is married to a pretty stable fabric that's on top of it, they have that kind of a fronted fabric that's on it. You will still see some sort of like debossing, crushing, embossing look to it. Something you probably use to your advantage if you're designing for it, but just throwing somebody's logo on it, they may or may not love the way it crushes. Just something that I've seen before, but I will admit something I didn't have a ton of experience with myself, because they're not my favorite for most work. It's not the kind of hats I would choose if I was choosing to sell something to somebody. Jenny says, I get it often from my customers who insist on bringing garments with zips inside the garment and places he wants embroidery. Yeah, this is a definite showstopper for most things. It's not that you can't always do it. Sometimes you can. But the clear thing to do, for me at least, for people who don't understand this, is to flip the thing inside out and go, okay, cool. I'm going to have to send this off to my tailor, seamstress, or sewist of choice and have them open this thing up, open up the seam and have it redone. That'll be about another this many dollars, pounds, or what have you to make that happen. How do you feel about that? Like, oh yeah, no problem. I'm going to have someone do the alterations so that I can stitch on it. Does that sound good to you? And most people are going to understand that's not great. But yeah, that's customer supplied garments are always a pain. I'll say my big headache with the customer supplied garments of that nature. We had a large car dealership that we worked with, and this car dealership group would bring in boxes of garments. Despite the fact that we had them work things out with us and talk about colorways and everything else, we would always have a mass number of colors that had to be adjusted for. So most of the logos, I would actually pre-create a design that had an outlined version so that I could use an outline that would offset it from colors or prints. That's the first thing I had to do with those people pretty frequently. There were usually multiple text colorways, and we discussed any unsupported text that was just free floating had to have the option for us to choose the text colorway, because they weren't going to write it down for every garment. But even then, even with all of that done, invariably they would bring in an either or all of the above garments that couldn't be hooped or garments that couldn't be embroidered. And frequently it was things like, I'm going to have a normal set of sports shirts, polo shirts, whatever they are. And that's a pretty standard middle ground we've talked about before when we talked about digitizing stock designs. But in the same box are burnouts or tissue tees or incredibly light t-shirts or some sort of performance wear that's incredibly light or incredibly stretchy. Maybe even to the point of things like swimwear would be included randomly. Or they would throw in things that had extremely high texture and that had to be dealt with. So things like Sherpa design or Sherpa pieces, polar fleece, toweling, And they would throw this all in as if we're just going to throw all of this at you and you're going to throw your logo on all of it. And that particular customer eventually got fired. When the salesperson who was servicing them, that customer was let go after the salesperson left, because it turned out not only were we not pricing for that as well as we probably should have been on review, the truth of the matter is it was constantly causing us more and more production time than we expected. So even when the pricing was done to spec, we weren't really making enough when we take into account all of the non-standard treatments and the design work that was being given away for that. Now, truthfully, for me, my favorite thing is when they just throw a couple of fleece pieces in, because I find that a knockdown stitch or light mesh fill or what have you, most of the time will handle quite a lot of it. It'll make it doable, if not perfect. But when we're talking about things that are lighter than that, then when we're dealing with, and this was a fully filled logo that had a mascot. So we got plenty of satins, plenty of fills, lots of outlining, lots of color. This particular piece was not a simple piece, and they often did event-based designs that were incredibly high color, often with gradients, fully filled, lots of small text, full name of the company, full name of the event, all included in these pieces. And very frequently, these were kind of dense. They were on the denser side just because of the amount of coverage they wanted. Even if you had done them as I do with a lighter hand, it was a lot of stitching to put into a lot of these garments. And they were a lot of stitching for a polo shirt. You can imagine what happens if you bring in the lightest possible t-shirt, the lightest possible performance wear, and want that to go on as well. Certainly that's the kind of customer where you have to start thinking, is this worth it, right? Is it worth it? So Cindy says, it drives me crazy to have an embroidery zip opening inside of a garment. I usually have to turn the hooping and my design. Not a big deal, but just more time hooping. You know, I love the embroidery access pockets when they're good. When they're in the right place, they're fantastic. When they're in the wrong place and you can't get a hoop to go where it's supposed to go, it's annoying. And I'll say I have done quite a lot of stuff. And when I talk about patches, the real original reason that I did patches was to cope with garments that you couldn't get in a hoop. I mean, it was both the golf bags with the big plastic inserts that you can't stitch through that people want things on, and doing mock stitched patches. That's where I did a leather patch that had monograms or designs on it, and then I would do a faux stitched edge and then use glue. I would use adhesive to adhere that down, so it looked like it was stitched on. But I used the embroidery machine to make a nice thick bean stitch edge where it looked like I had taken an industrial straight stitch machine to it. That was one of the reasons I started doing patches. Certainly also patches on things like insulated bags. I don't like embroidering through a lunch bag, because if it's insulated and I put a bunch of holes through it, I'm pretty sure that I've changed that R value a little bit as far as the insulation that we've got there. Insulation, things that are waterproofed, things also, tool bags. Worked for construction and contractors where the tool bags are full of straps, buckles, rivets, every manner of fixture. And frequently, most of those, you cannot put a hoop in it. You can't address it in almost any other way, but either by printing it or by adhering a patch. And when we want to try and get embroidered work for everybody, and much as I love to do coordinated pieces that aren't all the same logo, there are tons of companies who just want to throw an identifying logo on everything that's similar or the same. Creating a patch around that is a pretty painless way to convert a logo, very much like the knockdown is for textured substrates. Creating a patch out of the logo is a pretty painless way to get out of those troubles. All right, folks. So for that, I think we'll go ahead and close it down for today. That is enough for this Q&A grab bag. Next week, be prepared. There may not be a show at the usual time slot. There certainly won't be a live show. I'll try and do a pre-recorded show if I can. Otherwise, I will be off because I am off at a show. Fingers crossed, if everything goes the way it is supposed to go, then I should be out at Impressions Expo. So next week, folks, if you want to see me live, the way to see me on that Friday is go out to Impressions Expo in Long Beach, California, and I will be out there teaching. You're going to find that on the Thursday ahead of time, I'm teaching a small run patch class. So very much like some of the courses I've done before, it's a lecture style class, 3 hours with breaks, where I will discuss patches and how they work for you, how small run patches make sense for embroidery shops. That's going to be happening on that Thursday. On the Friday, we also, I have to say, I am now confused about which days which things are, but I have on Friday and Saturday, I have classes involving creating text and fonts. That's going to be one of the classes there. There's an editing for non-digitizers class that's being done. There's a short tour through 3D foam techniques. So basic 3D foam techniques, 45-minute course. So really not a long course, just going to go over the basics and getting people started up on that. And then I have an excellent opportunity. I'm going to be with Sam Young of Madeira, USA, and Jeff Fuller of the Embroidery Nerd. And we're going to be recapping our panel. So that's going to be really cool. We're going to be able to do the panel show that we did before and talking about embroidery. So that should be awesome to have your questions. You want to do a Q&A live, show up and ask me and ask Jeff some questions out there. And just to kind of let you guys know, that is not the only place I'm going to be. Like I said, crossed fingers. I know people have been talking about cancellations. Yes, there's some vendor cancellations. Yes, it's a smaller show than it has been, but we're still on board for now. Impressions Expo is going off in Long Beach. After that, you're going to find me at the end of February. We'll be at the Kansas City Deck Show. So the Decorated Apparel Expo will be going on. And in that one, I'll be doing a basic intro digitizing class. And there is another course as well attached for advanced editing. So digitizing editing on the menu for the DAX shows out in Kansas City. And unfortunately, no Minnesota this year. But so skip the next month. The month after that in April, we're going to be doing the Chicagoland, the Tinley Park, Illinois DAX show. So once again, daxshow.com should have information on both of those. And you'll be able to jump in and see me live if you want to. Like I said, backed up, boosted, masked, and everything else, but you should be able to see me in person. A lot of great content, a lot of content you might be able to get online, but if you are the kind of person who really just does better in person, who wants to be around other folks and get to ask them questions or hear the questions they ask and let that inspire you, then this is your chance to see us in person. So thank you very much, and hope to see some of you out in Long Beach. And if I don't, then stay safe, stay healthy, and I can't wait to see you again here, not next week, but coming up soon.